The wind cut across the plains of northern Nebraska like a steel blade, bending the tall, dry grass into waves that shimmered under the gray winter sun. Dust and frost clung to everything, glinting like tiny shards of glass in the pale light. In the midst of this biting cold stood a weathered farmhouse, its logs darkened by age and storms past. Luke Harlan tightened the straps on his worn leather gloves and stepped out onto the frost-crusted porch, boots crunching against the hard-packed snow. He squinted against the wind and surveyed the wall he had built the previous week. Two parallel lines of stout, weathered logs, their gaps carefully filled with stones and clay, holding the bitter Nebraska winter at bay. At least he hoped they did. From across the snow-swept road, neighbors had begun to gather, leaning against trucks and wagons, cups of steaming coffee clutched in gloved hands. Their eyes were a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "You're still at it, huh, Luke?" called Benny Thompson, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his mouth. "Those logs of yours look like a lopsided fence. You building a fort for prairie dogs now?" Luke didn't look up. He had grown used to the teasing over the years. He had learned that people didn't mind laughing at what they didn't understand. "Just keep an eye on the wind," he said quietly, hammer in hand, as he lifted the first vertical board and lined it against the logs. "Vertical boards?" Benny's tone was incredulous. "What, you think that'll stop the wind?" Luke set his jaw and drove the first nail home. The board shivered under the blow of the hammer, a deep thud that echoed across the frozen fields. "Physics," he said, finally glancing up. His face was pale from the cold, frost clinging to his beard, but his eyes burned with stubborn focus. "And patience." He leaned the second board, then the third, and the rhythm of hammering joined the roar of the wind like a duel. The boards, rough cut from a nearby lumber yard, were taller than he was, and when aligned against the log walls, they created a rigid vertical shield that he hoped would force the gusts upward instead of through the cracks. He worked quickly but deliberately, aware that even the slightest misalignment would render the effort useless. Across the road, laughter rippled among the neighbors. "He's gone off the deep end," muttered one man, shaking his head. A woman covering her mouth with a scarf giggled as another neighbor added, "Might as well wrap the house in tin and call it a day." Luke ignored them, though a small tension coiled in his chest. This wasn't about proving anything to the neighbors. It never had been. But he couldn't deny a flicker of satisfaction at imagining their faces when the walls actually worked. He had spent years watching the wind cut through his farmhouse, climbing under doors, crawling through cracks, mocking every stove, every blanket, every attempt at warmth. It wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. But that indifference had hardened him, taught him to study the flow of the air, the way gusts collided with obstacles, the patterns hidden in chaos. By mid-morning, the first row of boards was nailed securely, and Luke stepped back to measure the alignment. His fingers were numb despite gloves, his breath a ghosty mist in the icy air. He wiped his brow with a sleeve and squinted at the wind. It didn't roar as it had before. The boards flexed slightly but resisted, and for a fleeting moment, Luke imagined the gusts breaking, diverted along the vertical plane instead of tearing straight through. "Looks ridiculous," Benny called across again, though there was a hint of unease in his tone now. "You really think that's gonna hold?" Luke smiled faintly. "Just wait," he said, hammering the next board into place. The hours dragged. Boards went up one by one, nails flying from the hammer in rhythmic thuds that competed with the whistle of the wind. Luke's cheeks were raw from frostbite creeping beneath the scarf, his hands blistered from gripping wood and hammer alike, but he kept moving. There was a strange meditation in the work, a dialogue with the elements. He adjusted, realigned, pressed each board so it met the logs at the perfect angle, checking that the vertical structure would bear the full force of the winter gusts. By late afternoon, the vertical board stood tall against the horizontal log walls, an odd, geometric armor against the plains' fury. Luke stepped back, chest heaving, sweat freezing along his spine. The neighbors had grown quiet now, watching from a respectful distance, some still shivering in disbelief, others shading their eyes to study the construction. "Fine," Benny admitted finally, voice tight as he rubbed his hands together. It looks like it might do something. Still don't get why you didn't just insulate or..." "Because the wind finds weakness," Luke interrupted, his voice steady despite exhaustion. Insulation is wasted if the wind blows it out of the cracks. You need a barrier it can't push past, something to redirect it, not fight it head-on. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the frost-coated ground. The wind began to pick up, gusting in jagged sheets that rattled the old tin roof and whipped snow across the yard. Luke held his breath and stepped forward, leaning against one of the vertical boards. He pressed his hand to the surface and felt it flex slightly but not collapse. The wind buffeted him, swirling around the house, and he could hear the boards groan under pressure, but they held. A cautious smile crept onto Luke's face. This was only the first test. Night would bring the real challenge. He could feel it in his bones. The wind was patient, relentless, waiting for a weakness, probing for a flaw. But tonight he had given it something solid to contend with, something it could not simply rip apart. The neighbors lingered, some daring a few steps closer. "Well," Benny said, voice low now, all breaking through the teasing, "we'll see, I guess." Luke nodded, stepping inside to warm his chilled hands over the small cast-iron stove. The house was quiet, save for the soft whistle of the wind outside and the faint hum of the stove beginning to radiate heat. He glanced at the log walls through the frosted window, the vertical boards standing like sentinels, tall and stubborn against the gusts. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow the storm would return, fiercer and colder. Luke knew the boards might shiver, the nails might protest, and the wind might howl louder than ever before. But he had built something that night, something that might just change everything. He sank onto a chair near the stove, rubbing his hands together, eyes fixed on the barrier outside. The snow swirled in restless eddies, catching in the boards and crevices, but the walls remained intact. For the first time in a long, bitter winter, Luke allowed himself to imagine warmth, steady, defiant, resistant to the plains' fury. Outside, the neighbors began to shuffle back to their homes. Quiet now, whispers of curiosity replacing laughter. They would wait to see if Luke's vertical boards could truly stop the wind, but something unspoken had shifted. Respect, intrigue, and a reluctant hope that maybe, just maybe, this stubborn man had discovered something extraordinary. And somewhere deep in the night, as the wind howled against the house and the frost glimmered in pale moonlight, Luke Harlan felt it. The first fragile certainty that winter, for once, might not have the final word. Dawn broke over the plains in a pale wash of gray and gold, painting frost-coated fields in a brittle, fragile light. Luke stepped onto the porch, boots crunching through hardened snow, eyes scanning the vertical boards he had hammered into place just the night before. They looked almost alive, standing tall and stiff, shadows stretching long across the frozen yard. The wind was quieter now, a tense whisper that skittered over the landscape, testing, probing, like a predator circling. Luke shivered, not from cold alone, but from the anticipation. Today would tell him if his work could withstand the elements, or if the hours spent hammering and wedging were only the prelude to failure. Across the road, Benny Thompson shuffled toward him, scarf flapping in the wind. He stopped a few feet away, holding a steaming cup of coffee in both hands, eyes squinting. "I, didn't think they'd actually," his voice broke off, eyes flicking to the boards. "Might actually work, huh?" Luke nodded, voice low but steady. "Might, depends on the gusts today, watch closely." Benny's grin was hesitant. "Yeah, well, we'll see. Still looks like a lot of work for something that might blow over." Luke said nothing, letting his attention drift to the horizon. Dark clouds were gathering in the north, a low, rolling mass that promised more than a gentle breeze. He had learned over the years that storms didn't give warnings. They arrived, testing every structure, every plan, every ounce of preparation. By mid-morning, the first gusts arrived. They were sharp, slicing through the open stretches of snow like knives. Luke braced himself against one of the vertical boards, pressing his palms into the wood to feel the slight flex as it resisted the wind. He could hear it whistling, hissing as it collided with the wall, trying to find weak points, but the boards held firm. Neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by curiosity and the faint hope that Luke's stubborn construction might actually succeed. Martha Keene stood on the edge of her yard, wrapped in 3 scarves, a wool hat pulled low over her ears, hands clutching a thermos of coffee. Her grandchildren, bundled in layers of wool and fleece, trailed behind, eyes wide and cheeks pink from the cold. Luke walked across the frost, boots sinking slightly into the snow, and called to her. "You'll see soon enough, Martha, if it holds Thraug. This gust, it'll hold through most of winter." Martha's lips pressed together, a mixture of skepticism and relief in her expression. "Well, you'd better hope so," she murmured, "because I'm not sure how much more of this wind my nerves can take." Luke smiled faintly and returned to his work, inspecting the boards. A few had shifted slightly under the pressure, nails bent at odd angles. He removed the loosened boards and hammered them back into place, adjusting angles and securing braces against the horizontal logs. Every movement was deliberate, precise. There was no margin for error. The wind grew bolder as the day progressed, gusts tearing across the fields with jagged, unpredictable force. Snow swirled like fine sand in the sunlight, blinding and chaotic. Luke pressed another board into place, hammering nails that hissed as they pierced frozen wood. The boards groaned under the assault, bending slightly but refusing to break. Each flex, each small creak, was a conversation between man and elements, a negotiation in the language of resilience. Benny Thompson, unable to resist, stepped closer. "I still don't get it," he said, voice raised to carry over the roar of the wind. "Why vertical? Why not just more logs, more insulation?" Luke didn't stop hammering. "Because the wind doesn't care about more logs," he shouted back. "It finds the smallest crack, the tiniest weakness, and it will exploit it. Vertical boards force it up, make it move differently. You don't fight it, you guide it, redirect it." Benny rubbed his hands together, shivering. "Redirect it, huh? That's smart, I'll give you that." The neighbors began to pay closer attention, their amusement fading into cautious fascination. Some whispered among themselves, others simply watched, mesmerized by the way the boards swayed, groaned, and ultimately resisted the furious gusts. There was an unspoken tension threading through the crowd, a mix of hope and disbelief, curiosity and fear. By late afternoon, Luke had nearly completed the second row of vertical boards. Sweat and frost had crusted his hair, and his hands were raw, fingers stiff from gripping wood and hammer. The storm outside was relentless, gusts tearing across the fields with sudden, unpredictable ferocity. He pressed a particularly stubborn board into place, nailing it with a series of precise, rhythmic blows. The wind slammed against it, rattling the horizontal logs behind, but the board held. A sudden, stronger gust whipped across the yard, catching a loose scarf and sending it flying into the snow. Luke stumbled slightly, pressing both hands to the nearest board to steady it. He glanced at the neighbors, who held their breath, watching as the vertical structure bent, groaned, and resisted. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. Martha's youngest grandchild, a small boy no more than 7, pointed toward the boards. "Look, look, the wind can't get through," he shouted, his voice muffled by mittens and scarf. Martha laughed, relief breaking through her tension. "He's right," she said, turning to Luke. It actually works." Luke nodded, though he remained cautious. "It's holding so far, but winter isn't done yet. Tonight will test it harder than anything today." The first nightfall arrived, painting the snow and boards in soft, muted shades of gray and violet. Inside the farmhouse, Luke stoked the small cast-iron stove, feeling the warmth seep slowly into his frozen limbs. The wind outside screamed, a living thing battering the boards and logs, but Luke watched from the window as the vertical boards held firm, swaying slightly but defiant. From the neighboring yards, lights flickered behind frost-covered windows. Families huddled around stoves and fireplaces, sensing a subtle difference. Warmth was no longer fleeting, chased by the cold as it had been in previous years. It lingered, spread evenly through rooms, pushed against drafts, and refused to be carried away. Luke leaned against the windowsill, watching snow swirl violently around the boards. He could hear groans of protest from wood and nails, feel the tremor of impact in his feet through the floorboards. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but the results were undeniable. He scribbled quick notes in a small notebook, sketches of angles and placements, calculations of nail depth and board width. Each observation was a piece of a puzzle, a blueprint for survival. If this method could be replicated, the neighbors could all enjoy steady warmth, no longer at the mercy of winter's caprice. Hours later, the wind began to ease slightly, settling into a howl rather than a roar. Luke stepped outside, boots crunching through hardened snow to inspect the boards under the moonlight. They gleamed faintly, coated with frost that shimmered in pale silver. Not a single board had come loose, not a single nail had surrendered. He ran his gloved hand along the surface, feeling the rigid strength. His touch. Martha and her grandchildren emerged cautiously, drawn by curiosity and hope. "It's incredible," she whispered, awe in her voice. I didn't think it could actually do this." Luke smiled, teeth chattering slightly from cold and exertion. "It's not magic," he said softly. "Just respect for the wind, patience, and a little stubbornness." Benny shuffled closer, eyes wide in disbelief. You might have just figured it out," he said. "The wind, it's bending around it, not through it. It's amazing." Luke nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavily on him. "This is only the start," he said. "Tomorrow it will test us again. Tonight we hold. Tomorrow we learn even more." As the night deepened, the neighbors returned indoors, watching from frost-covered windows, whispering in hushed tones about the strange miracle in Luke's yard. The wind still howled, but it was a controlled chaos now. It tested the boards, yes, but could not break them. For the first time in years, there was hope that winter could be managed, that warmth could be preserved, that the relentless plains might yield. Not completely, but enough to allow life to continue without surrendering to frost. Luke stepped back inside, letting the heat of the stove seep into chilled bones. He glanced once more at the vertical boards through the window, shadows swaying under moonlight, stubborn, defiant, unbroken. Somewhere in the howl of the wind, he felt a quiet acknowledgement, a silent nod from the elements. Tonight, at least, the house and the hearts within would survive. The night stretched on, icy and relentless, but inside the farmhouse a fragile warmth lingered, spreading slowly through rooms, curling around corners, touching the edges of tables, floors, and walls. It was not perfect, not absolute, but it was victory enough. And for Luke, that was enough to know that the long, merciless winter might finally have met its match. The morning air was sharp, slicing through scarves and wool coats like a blade, carrying the scent of snow, wet earth, and the faint tang of frostbitten timber. Luke stepped onto the porch, boots sinking slightly into the hardened crust of overnight drifts. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the first hints of trouble. He didn't have to wait long. Dark clouds hung low, a thick, rolling blanket of gray that promised more than ordinary gusts. The wind, ever patient and cunning, had been gathering, whispering secrets in the skeletal trees, carrying news of the storm's growing strength. Benny Thompson appeared across the road, hunched against the wind, cheeks flushed and eyes wide. "Luke, it's coming, isn't it?" His words were more a plea than a question. Luke nodded, voice tight. "It's coming, and this time it'll push harder than anything we've seen. We need to be ready." Neighbors emerged cautiously from their homes, drawn by instinct and curiosity, their expressions a mix of awe and anxiety. Martha Keene led her grandchildren, bundled in layers that muffled their words and widened their eyes, toward Luke's yard. "We're ready," she said softly, though her fingers trembled as she tightened the scarf around her neck. Luke's gaze swept across the vertical boards he had hammered over the log walls, each one a silent sentinel against the wind. They flexed slightly under the first gusts, groaning in the language of wood and nail. It was a sound that set Luke's heart racing. He had learned to read it, to hear the difference between resistance and failure. By mid-morning, the storm hit in earnest. Gusts tore across the plains, sharp and jagged, lifting snow in chaotic spirals, slamming against boards and logs, testing every weak point. Luke ran from one end of his yard to the other, adjusting boards, hammering nails, pressing timber into place. The wind roared like a living beast, relentless, unforgiving, carrying the promise of frostbite and ruin. Tom Renshaw appeared next, dragging a section of loose board across his yard, eyes wide and voice hoarse. "Luke, this wind's insane. I can't keep it from tipping over." Luke grabbed the board, pressing it against a brace, hammering with precise, rapid blows. "Hold it steady," he shouted. "Lean with it, don't fight it. Let the wind push it so it locks tighter." Martha's corner of the yard was under siege. A particularly vicious gust had ripped through, dislodging several stones and toppling part of the vertical structure. She clutched her youngest grandchild against her chest as Luke arrived, sliding his hands around the loose timber. "We'll fix it," he yelled, voice nearly swallowed by the roar. "Step back, keep the little one safe." Together they worked, stone by stone, board by board, sweat freezing instantly to skin, breath misting in rapid clouds. The child's small hands pressed against a stone, helping in the only way they could, and Luke's heart clenched at the bravery in such tiny persistence. Across the neighborhood, chaos reigned. Walls flexed and groaned, nails bent, logs threatened to slide, but the community rallied instinctively. Benny and Tom hoisted boards and stones, voices raised in shouts, instructions flying over the roar. Every successful brace, every secured stone was met with a fleeting cheer, muffled by the howl of the storm. Hours dragged on, a blur of exertion and cold. Fingers bled, muscles screamed, faces stung from frost and exertion. Luke's gloves were shredded, his back slick with sweat and freezing snow, yet he moved relentlessly. Every gap sealed, every loose board secured, every log pressed against its neighbor was a small victory against the storm's merciless assault. The wind shifted suddenly, a sharp, unpredictable gust that drove snow into eyes and ears, snatching tools from frozen fingers. Luke stumbled but pressed on, hammering a brace into Martha's corner while shouting instructions to Benny, who was struggling to hold a leaning vertical board upright. "Don't let it bend forward," Luke yelled. "Lock it tight with the stones underneath." Time became distorted, minutes stretched like hours, and the horizon blurred into white chaos. Snow drifts piled higher, curling over fences, logs, and bricks. The wind carved channels, funneled through any gap it could find, testing the precision of every placement. Inside the farmhouse, heat from stoves and furnaces was no longer a gentle comfort but a fragile lifeline. Families huddled together, feeling warmth pool around them, fragile and precious, each exhale a small triumph over the storm. Luke's efforts were not just about boards and logs. They were about life, about shielding the small, the vulnerable from merciless cold. By nightfall, the storm reached its peak. Visibility dropped to near zero, snow whipped into horizontal sheets that cut like knives. Luke pressed a brace against a particularly stubborn corner of his wall, nails rattling as he hammered. A stone slipped under the pressure, and he lunged, fingers numb, to wedge it back. The wind tested him like a sentient force, probing for weakness, exploiting hesitation. Martha screamed over the roar as a corner of her wall threatened collapse, a funnel for the gale to pour directly into her living room. Luke surged toward her, grabbing her arm and the child at once, pressing them against his chest while securing a brace against the gust. "Hold it! We've got this!" he shouted. Neighbors rallied around, instinctively working together in the chaotic dance of survival. Tom heaved logs into place, Benny slammed nails with frozen fingers, and children, wrapped in layers of warmth, passed smaller stones where they could. Every effort, every ounce of strength, contributed to a collective resistance that the storm could not immediately overcome. The night seemed endless, the wind unrelenting, yet slowly, methodically, inch by inch, the walls held. Each log, each board, each carefully wedged stone became a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness. Luke's voice grew hoarse from shouting instructions, encouragement, and reassurance. His body trembled from exhaustion and cold, yet he pressed on, driven by a singular purpose, to ensure that warmth and life endured. By midnight, Luke could feel the first subtle victories. The walls flexed but did not break. The boards groaned but remained upright. Heat pooled behind the structures, moving with intent, curling around rooms, protecting families. Martha's grandchildren clung to blankets, eyes wide, mouths silent, sensing the tension but safe within the fortress they had helped defend. Luke leaned against a brace for a moment, chest heaving, eyes scanning the yard. Frost and snow clung to his hair, coat, and gloves, turning him into a living sculpture of ice and effort. Yet the sight of the walls standing, stubborn and defiant against the storm, brought a flicker of triumph that warmed him more than the stove ever could. The storm outside howled like a living entity, twisting, probing, relentless. But inside, warmth endured. The vertical boards, hammered with precision and respect for the wind, had held. Families were safe. Survival, fleeting and fragile, had been carved from chaos with bare hands and unyielding resolve. Luke looked across the neighborhood, seeing familiar faces etched with fear, exhaustion, and awe. He nodded quietly, not for recognition, but for himself, acknowledging the courage, persistence, and collective strength that had carried them through the night. As the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, pale and trembling, the storm began to ease, reluctant but inevitable. The vertical boards, coated with frost and snow, swayed slightly in the dying gusts, groaning but unbroken. Luke pressed a hand to the nearest board, feeling the subtle pulse of life in wood and nail, and allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The night had been a crucible, testing not only the walls but the spirit of the people behind them. And in that quiet, frozen morning, Luke Carter knew something profound. They had endured. They had faced the storm, bent but unbroken, and learned that courage, ingenuity, and community could shape even the harshest winter. The morning after the storm broke was deceptively calm. The wind had softened to a cautious whisper, threading through skeletal trees and lifting loose snow in lazy spirals. Luke stepped onto his porch, boots crunching over the icy crust, surveying the neighborhood that had endured the night. Every log wall, every vertical board, every stone wedged in place stood firm, a testament to human perseverance against the merciless winter. The boards flexed slightly under the light gusts, creaking softly, but they did not falter. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, blinking against the pale sunlight, faces wind-burned but alight with relief. Benny Thompson shuffled across the road first, shoulders hunched, eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know what to say," he admitted, voice raspy. "If it weren't for these walls, we'd have been frozen solid." His gaze lingered on Luke's creation, then across the yards where others had followed suit, forming a patchwork defense of timber and stone. "You saved us," he said almost reverently. Luke shook his head, brushing snow from his coat. "We all did," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We just followed the wind, worked with it instead of against it." He had learned long ago that victories shared were stronger than those claimed alone. Martha Keene approached next, leading her grandchildren who peered around the log walls with wide, cautious eyes. She stopped in front of Luke, pressing a hand to his arm. "You saved my house, my family. I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling with relief and gratitude. Her gaze swept across the vertical boards, the crooked but steadfast walls, and the snow-dusted neighborhood beyond. Luke smiled faintly, his cheeks red from cold and exhaustion. "You did the work too," he murmured. "We all did it. Every hand mattered." He glanced at the scattered yards where neighbors were already reinforcing corners, adjusting stones, and straightening boards. The collaborative effort of survival had transformed the landscape into something more than protection. It was a statement of community and resilience. By mid-morning, the scene had taken on a quiet, celebratory energy. Families inspected one another's walls, offering tips, sharing stories of what had held and what had nearly failed. Small triumphs and minor failures were acknowledged in equal measure. Children, cheeks pink from the cold, laughed and pointed, their voices echoing through the crisp air. Gone was the mockery and skepticism of weeks past, replaced now by curiosity, respect, and cautious pride. Luke moved among them, adjusting a brace here, demonstrating the correct wedge of a stone there, his hands raw and blistered but steady. He watched as the community absorbed the lessons he had painstakingly learned. Respect for the wind, patience in placement, understanding that warmth and safety were earned through careful attention and effort. By noon, news of their success had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Curious visitors arrived from nearby valleys, snapping photos, jotting notes, and hovering with fascination over the network of timber and stone defenses. Luke found himself explaining angles, airflow, and the subtle art of winterproofing homes, emphasizing observation and adaptability over brute force. Each explanation was met with nods, some incredulous, others inspired. He realized the impact of their efforts could extend far beyond this one street, a living example of resilience in action. County Inspector Susan Mayer arrived mid-afternoon, boots crunching softly over the hardened snow. She circled Luke's wall, tapping braces, examining the careful placement of stones and boards. Her professional tone was tempered by admiration. "This is solid," she said slowly. "You should document it, could help a lot of people next winter." Luke shrugged, faintly smiling. Documentation had never been his priority, survival had, but he understood her point. The lessons embedded in the walls, the combination of physics, patience, and ingenuity, could save lives, and that knowledge, once shared, was more valuable than any report or certificate. As the day wore on, families began internalizing the lessons. They anticipated the wind, reinforced weak points, and strengthened walls with confidence. Children retrieved small stones, grandchildren stacked logs under careful supervision, and neighbors collaborated seamlessly. What had begun as a solitary experiment by Luke had transformed into a collective effort, knitting a community together in shared triumph over the merciless elements. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the snow-laden fields, illuminating the vertical boards with a soft, tea-golden glow. Luke stood on his porch, surveying the neighborhood he had helped fortify. Lights flickered warmly behind frosted windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint laughter of children echoed across the crisp air. Winter's bite remained, but it had been tempered. Humanity had faced it and endured. Martha approached again, this time carrying a loaf of bread and a steaming thermos. "You've done more than protect homes," she said quietly. "You've reminded us what it means to endure, to care for each other." Luke accepted the bread, nodding. Words felt inadequate to capture the relief, the triumph, the bond forged in frost and fire. Later, as the neighborhood quieted and families retreated to the warmth of stoves and furnaces, Luke returned to his own house. He sat by the stove, letting the gentle heat seep into his frozen limbs, reflecting on the past day's labor. The walls outside, crooked yet steadfast, stood as silent sentinels against the wind. He pressed his hand to the nearest board, feeling the subtle pulse of life in the wood, and a quiet satisfaction filled him. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. Every gust, every shift of timber, every stone wedged into place had left an imprint on his mind. Luke understood that preparedness was not a one-time effort, but a continuous negotiation with nature, patience, and ingenuity. And now, at least for the moment, they had survived. And in that survival was a profound victory, proof that courage, knowledge, and collaboration could bend even the harshest winter to human will. As night descended, snow settling into crystalline drifts, Luke stepped onto the porch one last time. The horizon was painted with muted purples and grays, the wind a gentle murmur now, testing only faintly, as if acknowledging its temporary defeat. The vertical boards flexed softly in the moonlight, groaning but unbroken, silent witnesses to human determination. Lights glowed from houses behind them, warmth radiating into the long, cold night. Families slept, safe and steady, behind walls built with hands raw from labor but hearts full of resolve. Luke closed his eyes, breathing in the sharp, clean air, feeling the warmth behind every stone and board. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The battle with winter was far from over. Storms would come again, stronger, colder, relentless. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet certainty. He, his neighbors, and the walls they had built together could endure. They had reclaimed a measure of control, warmth, and hope in a world ruled by relentless cold. He stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, letting the quiet envelop the room. Outside, the wind whispered against logs and boards, but it no longer ruled. Not tonight. Not here. The storm had tested them, but humanity had answered with ingenuity, courage, and stubborn resolve. And sometimes, Luke thought, that was enough to hold the cold at bay, not just for the body, but for the spirit. And in that moment, Luke Carter felt at last a deep, resonant peace. The walls had held, the families were safe, the lessons had been learned. The laughter, the struggle, the shared endurance, all of it crystallized into a quiet, cinematic triumph. Warmth preserved, community strengthened, and hope secured against the harsh, unyielding winter.